Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. For this week's podcast, I had the honor of interviewing Dr. Nadia Sabeh, also known as Dr. Greenhouse. She is the president and founder of Dr. Greenhouse Incorporated, an agricultural and mechanical engineering firm that specializes in the design of HVAC systems for indoor plant environments. Dr. Sabeh has her PhD in agricultural engineering from the University of Arizona's Controlled Environment Agricultural Center, and she is a licensed mechanical engineer in the state of California. For over 20 years, she has dedicated her education and career to helping farmers control their environments, allowing them to grow crops indoors, in greenhouses, and in facilities that would otherwise be impossible or impractical to do so. In this week's episode, we talk about a variety of topics ranging from VPD to plant transpiration to optimizing your drying and curing environment. Now on to the show. Hi Nadia, thanks for coming on the show today.
Hi Tad, thank you so much for having me again. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Yeah, I always enjoy my conversations with you, and I wanted to start off just chatting a little bit about what you've been up to since the last time we talked.
Wow, I feel like so much has happened since the last time we talked. In fact, I think the last time you and I really talked was the last conference that I went to before the pandemic started, which was the Indoor Agriculture Energy Conference in San Diego back in February of 2020. That was a super cool conference. Great content, great people, and great to catch up with people like you. We've been doing pretty good, even with COVID and the pandemic. Since you and I saw each other in San Diego, we've hired 2 more engineers, full-time engineers. So we are now a staff, including myself, of 4 engineers. We also hired a marketing person, and we have, our admin staff, and we are 7 strong right now. So we've been growing over the last year and a half. So that's been really exciting. We are approaching, I think, 150 projects since I started Dr. Greenhouse. We are actually celebrating our 5th year. So we officially, January 1st of 2022, will be 5 years since starting Dr. Greenhouse, first as a sole prop and then as a corporation. It's amazing to think that, I started by myself 5 years ago, and now I have a staff of 7, and we continue to grow and work on projects all over the country and spattering around the world, both in cannabis as well as leafy greens and berries and tomatoes and all other sorts of plants you can think of that people are trying to grow indoors. It's been a wild ride. I attended, my first conference in a year and a half live. I was at the cannabis conference last month, and it was so great to see people and catch up with people. And it was, I like that event a lot just because it's very educational in content. A lot of great people. And we actually did a podcast we posted just a couple weeks ago where I talked to people on the exhibit floor and asked them a couple questions about the state of the industry and what they learned at the conference. And it's really fascinating because out of, I think, the 7 or 8 people that we talked to, everybody had a different response, had different thoughts. And so I just love hearing all those different perspectives. That's what we've been up to, just busy, getting more and more projects, a lot more repeat clients, which, is always a good sign. It means we're doing something right. Just meeting a lot of great people, even though it's remote, but it's kind of fun because we get to see people's fur babies and real babies, and it's nice.
That's so wonderful to hear. When I hear people talk about HVAC, I hear your name come up a lot, even by other HVAC experts. So it's wonderful to have you back on the podcast, and it's wonderful to hear that people are finding out about the services that you're offering and that you're expanding. what, you know, and some of the things I just want to touch on here and we'll have in the podcast links is that you are doing a podcast as well, which is wonderful. You know, people should definitely check that out, and I'll have that on the podcast page. And then you're also doing these webinars that are free for people to listen in and learn about a lot of these topics too. So I highly suggest people check that out as a great resource. And yeah, so beyond that, one of the things you and I had just talked about prior to recording here was, you know, VPD and how that's such a buzzword still. And I know we talked about last podcast, but you know, I think reviewing it and kind of expanding on it a little bit would be a great place to start the podcast. So I'll kind of let you take it from here.
Yeah, sure. You know, a vapor pressure deficit is somewhat of I don't know, a difficult parameter to wrap our brains around, but it is so important in terms of the health of our plants, whether you're growing outside or in a greenhouse or inside. Plant transpiration rates, plant quality, their nutrient delivery is all really dependent on the vapor pressure deficit. So, in a nutshell, what VPD is it's the difference between what the vapor pressure is inside the air. So let's say you're in an indoor grow room and you have a specific temperature or humidity of that room, and the at that temperature and humidity, you have a vapor pressure. And the vapor pressure deficit is what is the vapor pressure of the room compared to the saturation vapor pressure at that same air temperature. So, what we're really trying to figure out is sort of how dry the air is. And the best way to think about it is the key word, which is pressure. The bigger the vapor pressure deficit is, the more pressure we're putting on a plant to evaporate water. Same with humans, right? If we have a high vapor pressure deficit, if it's dry, let's say we're in Southern California and we're in a pool and we get out of the pool and we feel cool immediately because that water is evaporating from our skin. That's because we have a pretty high vapor pressure deficit. It's dry compared to what the temperature is. But if we were in, say, Florida, you travel 3,000 miles due east, the humidity is so much higher that the vapor pressure deficit is so much smaller that water takes a lot longer to evaporate. Well, it's the same exact thing with plants, is that, at the stomata is liquid water, right? It's pulled water from its roots and it's transported it through its stem and it's up to the leaf and into the stomata, and it's liquid water and it's saturated. And depending on the pressure that the air is putting on it, depending on how dry that air is, that's how quickly the plant is going to then evaporate and transpire that water. And the reason VPD is so important is this idea of transpiration, right? So the bigger the VPD is, the faster the plant's going to transpire. The lower the VPD is, the slower the plant is going to transpire. And transpiration is so critical to the plant's health. Transpiration helps with, of course, transporting water from the roots all the way through the plant. Within that water are the nutrients coming from the soil or from the substrate that you're growing in. So that water is carrying nutrients to all the different plant parts. If we didn't have transpiration, there'd be no way to get all those nutrients coming from these beautiful soils to the other plant parts. It helps cool the plant through that evaporative cooling process, and it also helps a little bit with photosynthesis, just because we need a little bit of that hydrogen molecule to create those carbohydrates, right, during photosynthesis. So transpiration and VPD are so closely linked. And if you have a low rate of transpiration, then what you might see is that plants could wilt. You can see some nutrient deficiencies. Photosynthesis might be slower. On the other hand, if your transpiration rate is too high, if the VPD is so high that in the room or the air is so dry, then transpiration could be so quick that if you don't have enough water at the roots in the soil and the substrate, then your plant will dry out, and that's when you start to see your plant wilt because there's not enough water for the plant to pull up through it and then evaporate into the air. The other thing is that you can get nutrient deficiencies if the plants transpire too quickly, including, and probably the biggest one is calcium. Calcium is transported with water. So if the water literally is moving at a velocity too quick to carry this large calcium molecule with it, then you'll see calcium deficiencies, and that is usually seen by sort of like these brown edges along the leaves, especially new leaves. They're the most susceptible to that. So, yeah, VPD and transpiration, plant health, plant growth, all super intertwined together. And I love hearing, I just mentioned that I was at this conference last month, and the number of people that talked about VPD, or that VPD was just in the conversation, just in their, their lingo, has increased so much since I started sort of preaching about VPD a few years ago. And I'm glad to hear HVAC manufacturers talking about VPD, growers talking about VPD, monitoring and controls companies talking about using VPD as a metric to monitor and manage the room environment. It's definitely becoming part of our everyday language, which is great. It's going to be great for everybody.
Wow, so that made me think about a couple different things here. So when we talk about transpiration, you want it to be sufficient to where you're not causing the plant to work too hard, which would limit your plant growth, but also not too slow that you have water or humidity in the air that could potentially lead to pathogen issues
Yeah,
too, like mold and mildew.
absolutely. So, when when the humidity is high, that means that the vapor pressure deficit is low. And we know that when the humidity is high, that mold tends to grow, right? That mold, it has a high water activity when the humidity is greater than 60%. When you have a stressed plant or you have a drying plant, I would say that a plant that you've chopped and are now putting in a dry room, that's a pretty stressed situation for that branch because it has lost its, I don't know, its major body part moving water through it. And so as it's desiccating, as it's drying, if we don't drop that humidity pretty low and we don't drop the moisture out of that plant fairly quickly, then molds are going to be like, oh, hey, this is awesome. I have like this, really stressed out plant that still has parts of it living as it's gasping for its last breath. I'm going to take advantage of it and grow there. For a living plant, if the humidity is too high and the vapor pressure deficit is too low, then what can actually happen, because there's not enough pressure to evaporate the water from the stomata, is that liquid water that the plant has lifted to the leaf and to the stomatal opening can stay can just sit there, and now you have this exposed water. I mean, it's not a droplet necessarily, but you have this mouth that's open, ready to breathe out, and that can now become a place where mold can find a place to grow. On the other hand, if the VPD is so high and the room is so dry, so you're afraid of molds growing, right? You're afraid of having too much moisture in the room. You're afraid of condensation, right? And mold growth. And so you're like, okay, I'm going to pull as much moisture out of the air as quickly as possible, and I'm going to create a really dry environment so that those molds can't grow. Well, what ends up happening is that the plant gets really stressed out. And so now you have a stressed out plant. And this is, and I think cannabis growers inherently know this, right? Because a lot of them will try to drop the temperature, try to drop the humidity in the last week or two of the flowering plant's life. And what they're doing, whether they realize it or not, is stressing the plant so it thinks it's going to die, because it is about to die, and that causes it, right, to create more trichomes and terpenes and colors and all those beautiful aesthetic things that we're trying to get out of the plant. But if we do that too soon, then the plant is stressed, and now these mold spores are like, hey, I can take advantage of you. Your immune system is compromised, and like there's not as many places for me to land, but when I do land and I do find, a nice spot, I'm going to take you over. And so growers don't necessarily realize that it's not just high humidity that can be detrimental to their plants and cause mold growth and disease, but it's also low humidity that can do the same. Powdery mildew is actually really interesting, in that it actually propagates or it actually transports its spores through dry air. The spores do need like a moist surface in order to grow, but they need it to be dry in order to move from one location to the other location. So you manage, I just imagine a cannabis, grow room, and it's really dry, and you have all these circulation fans that are blowing air around and creating air movement, helping with transpiration and help break up the boundary layer across the leaf. And well, you just moved, mold spores, powdery mildew mold spores from one place to the rest of your room. And then let's just say you don't have the best control as you switch from lights on to lights off and you get a humidity spike. You just blew all those spores everywhere, and now you created, inadvertently, an environment where those mold spores are going to be super happy to propagate, and now you don't just have a problem in one place, you have a problem everywhere. So I want growers to know that too dry can be just as detrimental to the quality of your plant and disease control as is too high of a humidity.
Yeah, and one thing you touched on there from a transpiration perspective was this idea of deficiencies showing in the plant due to its ability to transpire either too high or too low. One thing that I've talked about in previous podcasts, like the one with Don Marshall, that I thought was interesting, is the idea of root hair death. So both too much water in the soil and too little in the water soil causes root hair death, which creates the same symptoms in the fact that the plant can no longer effectively take up water. So they're going to present fairly similar, even though the causes are, both water related, but on two extremes. And so I just wanted to remind folks of that because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very good point. Having soil, having a substrate that's overwatered, right? That's too wet. You prevent oxygenation, right? And the roots need oxygen. Yeah, your plant is using CO2, but your roots are using oxygen. And if you don't have air gaps, then your roots are going to die. On the other hand, if there's no water, right, and now you have this high VPD, you have this dry room that you're trying to grow in, your plants are just going to wilt and fall over because there's no water to transpire and lift them up. That is one of the other reasons why transpiration is so important for non-woody plants, is that they actually hold the plant up, right? Like that's what we're seeing when leaves wilt, is that we're losing water in the plant. Well, the trunk of that plant is being held up through the hydrogen bonds of the water moving through that plant through transpiration. There's no
Cool.
bark, right? There's no wood that's holding that plant up. It is water that's holding that plant up. And so the first signs of not having water is first, the leaves dry out. But if your plant starts to fall over, you're in trouble. Like you've probably passed the wilting point and you're not going to recover that plant.
Yeah. So when you're, one question I had is when you're thinking about VPD, there's a lot of variables that create the temperature and humidity in a room, which all relate to this ratio. What are your main variables that you're looking at when we talk about controlled environment agriculture? Really anything from say biomass to media, bringing in air and exiting air. How do all those relationships work together, and how do you approach that, as an engineer?
Yeah, I mean, every variable when growing a plant is interconnected with another variable or multiple variables. As an HVAC mechanical engineer, we are pretty focused on, the aerial environment, the environment of the air around the plant, right? We're trying to control temperature and humidity and vapor pressure deficit, so that we can control transpiration. But also, temperature of the air affects the leaf temperature, which affects the rate of photosynthesis. And so, we VPD is not mutually exclusive from temperature and humidity, and they're not necessarily exclusive from themselves either. They all sort of work together, and beyond that, the other parameters that we're interested in to control plant growth around the air is carbon dioxide, because plants can't photosynthesize without CO2, as well as the light environment and the quality of the air. And the quality of the air includes, does it have pests and pathogens in it? We hope not. Are there, dust particles? Odor is another air quality measure that we help growers control and mitigate through our designs. And although we don't design lights, our HVAC designs are incredibly dependent on the type and quantity and intensity of the lights that growers are using to cultivate their plants. I mean, it is the number one load. Assuming that you're in a building that is well insulated, if you're in an indoor facility, then the primary load is going to be, the primary load, by load I mean heat gain to the room, is going to be from the lights. And then your primary, dehumidification load is coming from the plants transpiring. If you're in a greenhouse, it's actually kind of the same. It's not the lights, it's sunlight. Solar radiation accounts for 65 to 70% of the total heat gain into a greenhouse. And then again, you still have plants transpiring, and maybe you have water evaporating from the soil, from the media, to account for. But if we can get pretty much 90%, 85 to 90% of the way there with our HVAC designs and equipment selections, if we know what the lights are, and if we know what plants you're growing and how much you're going to water them and how frequently you're going to water them. And, light, carbon dioxide, and temperature are three variables that are so essential to plant growth and photosynthesis that there is actually a lot of research going on, academic research specifically around lettuce plants and tomato plants and all these other horticultural crops that we can study at the university level that's getting federal funding, to figure out how to co-optimize these three variables. Um, it because every plant has an optimum, it has a curve, where as you increase the temperature, photosynthesis increases, and then it hits some peak, and then it starts to drop off. Well, you see a similar curve when it comes to carbon dioxide, when it comes to light. But the point at which all three of those peaks intersect together, that is the optimal point at which we want to grow our plant. And every plant has a different peak for each of those three variables. I'm not kidding. What you would see for lettuce would look different than what you would see for basil, than what you would see for cucumber, than what you would see for probably cannabis sativa versus cannabis indica versus, the thousands of strains and genetic crossbreeds that there are out there. And that's one of the reasons why cannabis is so challenging, is because there are so many strains and cultivars out there that it's hard to figure out what the optimal point is for those three specific variables for every single one of those strains. I mean, I think something that would help this industry a lot would be to just find like 5 or 10 strains that everybody loves, everybody agrees on, is available to everyone, and we could just optimize the control variables for those and then start playing with all the others. But, aside from that, what kind of drives me crazy sometimes when I talk to certain cannabis growers is this lack of understanding of the interactions between these three variables. So I'll walk into a room and, they'll have, 1,000-watt high pressure sodium lamps, and they'll be running their CO2 at 1,500 parts per million. But then they're trying to control to a temperature of 75 degrees. And essentially what they're doing is that they're hitting the accelerator and the brake at the same time. Say what you want to say about the research coming out of Mississippi, right? We know it's a crappy strain. We know that it's super old, and nobody grows this type of cannabis anymore. But, there is a study that came out that said, really the optimal temperature for cannabis is around 80 or 82 degrees. But I rarely see growers operating at that temperature. And I get it. I know why they're doing it, because if the AC system went down, right, if you're operating at 80 or 82 degrees, you only have a few degrees of movement. Really, at 85 degrees, the plant just shuts down. So it's better, right? Like if you are uncertain about your AC equipment operating when you're running high pressure sodium lamps and at 82 degrees, and you think that your AC system could break down, then yeah, running your room at 75 degrees so that you have sort of this 10-degree window to make a fix, right? To get a temporary solution in there until you can get a compressor replaced or do whatever. I get that risk assessment, but with the technology that we now have today, versus 10 or 15 years ago, we should have a lot more confidence in our HVAC equipment to keep operating even if our temperature is at 80 or 82 degrees. If every room, if these cannabis facilities were using 1,000 watts, 80 degree temperature, and 1,500 parts per million, I mean, I think the yields would skyrocket. I mean, they would be so much higher. And growers who I've talked to that are towing that line, that are trying to optimize those three variables together, are having really successful results. Now, what I want to say about raising that temperature, if there's a grower out there that's like, okay, I'm going to play with raising the temperature. I'm growing at 75 degrees and 50% relative humidity right now. So I'm going to adjust to 77 degrees, right? I feel comfortable at 2 degrees. My AC unit hasn't failed on me yet. And they raise the temperature. You should also be raising the relative humidity. So for every degree increase in temperature that you add to your target room set point, you should increase the relative humidity by 3 to 5%. So if you were growing at 75 degrees and 50% relative humidity, and now you want to go up to 77, you should probably be closer to, 60% relative humidity, 68, 70% relative humidity. If you're going to hit 80 degrees, this is a scary number for growers, I know, but if you're at 80 degrees, you should probably be closer to 65 or 70% relative humidity. I know that's scary, but that's a VPD of 1 to 1.2 kilopascals, which is the sweet spot for healthy, productive plants. Again, if you want to stress your plant and chill it at the end and deplete it of water and nitrogen and all these things that you do to stress the plant at the end of life, yes, I get, lower the temperature, lower the humidity, make it feel like it's, late fall in Humboldt, right? And that plant is going to die. But during your normal production, target a higher temperature, target a higher humidity. Your plant is going to be so healthy that those molds that you're concerned about are not going to have, a place to grow, because the plant is going to be healthy and it's going to be able to fight those diseases off.
That's so interesting. That was great information. Anecdotally, a good friend of mine, Justin McGill, he had an employee who accidentally, I don't remember exactly how it happened, but essentially had a huge humidity spike in his room for a period of time before he caught it. And his employee, his name was Buster, did this accidentally in this medical room, and the plants just took off. And so he started calling it swamp mode, because essentially that higher humidity, higher temperature in veg really led to, like you said, much healthier plants, and they weren't seeing powdery mildew take over. Just, I think, relation to what you're alluding to, and this idea that the plants are healthier too. So, I don't think humidity is something we necessarily have to be afraid of as much as we have been, 15, 20 years ago when people were growing in their basements and closets. I think we have a better understanding of it. But one of the things that you talked about that I think I just want to reiterate is this idea of the massive genetic diversity that we're seeing in cannabis production. So when we talk about a commercial facility, they may have upwards 15, 20 or more different cultivars in a given room. And so trying to optimize that room for all the cultivars is really impossible because of that diversity and each one liking slightly different optimal points. So trying to hit a target that works for, as many plants as possible in that room. And I realize that could be specific to each facility, but I think having that range is really, really important.
I mean, like being a politician, if you're trying to make everyone happy, you're making no one happy. And that's basically what we're doing with these strains and cultivars. If you have half a dozen different strains in the same room, a grower is probably trying to find a temperature and humidity range that all of those strains can grow under, but none of them are going to be optimized for any of those strains, right? And that is a problem. There have been a few growers that we've worked with that are strain specific to their grow room, or they have two strains that have similar physiologies and environmental responses, and they've learned that, and so they grow those together. Because there is so much genetic diversity, it is so hard to figure out what the ideal conditions are for any of those strains, because there's just not there. Even growers who are doing their own internal R&D, I don't know of any, and maybe you do, and I'm sure there's some out there who are looking strain specifically, at light levels. Hopefully they're looking at temperature and humidity levels as well, and CO2, but probably they're focused on light. And, when we work with growers in vertical farms and they're growing, say, lettuce and arugula and basil, one of the recommendations that I'll give them is I'll say, look, arugula is a cool weather plant. Lettuce is a mild weather plant, and basil is a hot weather plant. There's a reason why tomatoes and basil are good companion plants. Well, there's several reasons, but one of which is that they both like a lot of sun and a lot of heat. And the tomato plant helps shade the basil plant. They also produce chemicals that protect each other in the soil. You might be interested to know that, Ted, if you didn't know that already.
Yeah.
But so here, let's just say we have these three species, right? You have arugula, lettuce, and basil, and they like different conditions. So what I'll tell growers is, look, let's take advantage of that. We will have the outlet from the air conditioner start where the arugula is because it likes cold temperatures. And then it's going to move across the lettuce plant. And then after it's picked up all that heat and humidity from the plants and from the lights, is then going to hit the basil plant, and that basil plant is going to be basking in the warmth. And so you can literally, right, we can design this HVAC system to literally have these plants like go with the flow, or grow with the flow. But with cannabis, it's so hard because I don't know the difference. I personally don't know the difference between, I don't know, what, Gorilla Glue likes and what, I don't know, Super Glue likes. And maybe they're both because they're I don't know. Or what an indica versus a sativa like. And I've had growers say, well, this is an indica, but it grows like a sativa. Or I have this sativa that grows like an indica. And, it's like, oh, what does that mean, right? Are they just talking about the physiology? Are they talking about how they water and the nutrients they give it? Are they talking about the lights that it like, right? Like, I mean, when you say one is like the other, what is the grower thinking that means? And I bet it's different for every single grower. And so, ideally, again, we find these specific genetic strains that everybody agrees on, and we can start there. Or if growers are doing their own internal R&D, they're looking at all the variables and not just focused on one to figure out, which of their cultivars and strains are like each other in all the ways, not just one way.
Yeah, as a scientist and an engineer, I can understand your desire for consistency across genetics. But the challenge there, the counterpoint to that is one, commercial growers need to grow the hype cultivars, the hype strains that people want in the market. You have to be able to sell your
Yes,
product.
true.
So that's one thing. The second thing I would add to that is we don't really know exactly what the medicinal capabilities of this plant are, and so exploring the genetic diversity is really important at this stage of the game. And I think that will continue as we learn more about the entourage effect and how the terpenes and cannabinoids and all these different phytochemical responses create a certain effect for various human beings that are dealing with different ailments. So as nice as it would be to have everyone grow Big Macs, I just don't think we're at that point in history right now like we are with other commercial crops due to some of these medicinal qualities. But I get what you're saying there.
That's a very good point. And, just a couple of thoughts about that. One is, for greenhouse growers who do have control over their environment, maybe not as precise and consistent as an indoor facility, greenhouses are more susceptible to their external environment, right? Whether it's a cloudy day or a really hot sunny day or a freezing cold day, you have to be able to live within a larger range of conditions, or be able to cultivate your plant and make those adjustments, right, necessary to keep your plant healthy and productive, even when you don't have the ideal situation. And I've been really impressed with some of our clients and some of the growers that we've talked to who are who are looking for genetics that fit their environment as opposed to trying to force an environment on a specific strain. So if you're, in Texas or Florida, or somewhere that's really humid, finding genetics, finding strains that are less susceptible to mold pressures in a high humidity environment is going to make your life so much better, and probably the cost of installation and production a lot lower, because you're not trying to install air conditioners or dehumidifiers or these super power hungry pieces of equipment to dry your greenhouse out to grow a strain that likes it dry. And so but that's what breeding is. And we've been breeding so many crops for 10,000 years, and we're just scraping the surface here with cannabis. And maybe in 10,000 years we'll have like the very perfect strains, that we all can enjoy for all sorts of reasons. Um, and just in terms of the medicinal qualities of the cannabis flower of the plant, it's similar to what we're learning about other horticultural crops. That I'm not a lighting person necessarily, but of course there's a lot of research around light. But we know that PAR, photosynthetically active radiation, is necessary for photosynthesis, right? And photosynthesis is growth. Photosynthesis is fixing carbon dioxide to produce carbohydrates. But that does not necessarily translate into the quality characteristics of the plant. And what we have been learning for all sorts of plants is that it's all those sort of in between wavelengths. It's the edge wavelengths that are responsible for color, that are responsible for the anthocyanin that's produced by a red oak leaf lettuce. What I love about that particular compound that plants produce is that it's only produced when that lettuce plant is exposed to UV. If you never expose that plant to UV, it would be green. But the second, well, maybe minutes that it's exposed to UV light, it produces the red color. And what scientists think is that the anthocyanin is actually the plant's natural sunscreen. And so it's protecting itself from UV. Well, we think it's a really pretty plant, right? And we want to eat it. And so, learning about this with cannabis as well, right? What are the colors? What are the terpenes? What are the CBD profiles, right, that we can produce from all these other wavelengths of light that are not necessarily shown on the McCree curve? And I think that's really exciting. And I think the same is going to be discovered with temperature and humidity and VPD control, with CO2 control, that maybe by dropping the carbon dioxide level to 400 parts per million, during veg, maybe produces, I don't know, a certain different quality of plant. I mean, something that we know, if you track global CO2 levels, is that the CO2 naturally increases from spring through fall. And why does that happen? Well, because in the spring and the summer, right, plants are growing really quickly and they're consuming the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. And then as they're dying, their respiration rates start to take over their photosynthesis rates, right? They don't need to grow anymore in the fall. They're dying now. And so that death is actually releasing CO2, and there's less plant matter to absorb that CO2. So maybe, I don't know, maybe a cannabis plant wants lower CO2 levels, when it's young, or in a middle stage, right? High levels early, because you have these high levels holding over from the winter. and then maybe lower CO2 levels in the middle of its life, and then boost it again in late flower when we already know that CO2 levels are high in the atmosphere. I don't know. I just literally made that up right now on the fly while talking to you. But I mean, but that's the type of right, like that's the type of science that is so interesting about growing any plant. I think, and the fact that we get to control those variables by growing in greenhouses and growing indoors. I don't know. That's the fun. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's exciting.
Yeah, so two main takeaways I have from what we've talked about so far is one, we can't look at any one of these variables in a vacuum. They all relate to each other. And so when we're talking about lighting, or we're talking about VPD, or we're talking about CO2, we really need to be talking about all of these things in conjunction. And then my other
Exactly.
thought relating to all this is when we look at research that's been done, we have to realize that that research was done on a particular strain, particular genetics, and that may not appropriately apply exactly to our environment. So we can't say, this is optimal CO2 in this facility. This is optimal VPD. This is optimal, you know, PAR levels. We need to take that data and assimilate it, and then try and extrapolate how this might apply to our personal situation, I guess, or room for our plants and those
Yeah.
genetics. Does that
Yeah.
is that fair to say?
Abs- Absolutely. Yeah, you nailed it. And if I were a grower, I would probably pick my favorite strains. And what's a favorite strain? It's super robust and never gets powdery mildew, or maybe it has low yields but really high THC quality, or maybe just people just love it for whatever reason. Starting with those few strains, and if you have an R&D room, try to find what at least CO2, temperature, VPD, and light levels are. Those combinations work best for your plant. Um, and and then grow those plants, maybe even with all of its sister strains that you have there, but now you've optimized the environment for your quote unquote favorite, right? And the others are they're going to grow, right? They're going to be fine, but they're just not going to be optimized. Or ideally, you're growing, one or two very similar strains in the same space, which is an argument for having smaller rooms, right? Of having rooms that are maybe 1,000 or 2,000 square feet, as opposed to a room that's 6 or 10,000 square feet, where, if you have 10,000 square feet of a flower room, you are absolutely going to have a lot of strains that you're growing. And it's just going to make it even more challenging to find the sweet spot where all of those strains are able to grow well. Um, so yeah, and I want to make sure that people realize too that it's we're talking a lot about the upper environment around the leafy part of the plant, but what happens at the root level is also impacted by what happens above, right? Everything from your nutrient levels and how frequently and how much you water, um, to even how much evaporation you get from your substrate that you're growing on. We have seen growers are growing in 5 or 10 or larger gallon pots, fabric pots, and there's a large surface area of exposed substrate, and here they're watering once or twice a day, and you can see, like, if they're actually tracking temperature and humidity in the room, you can see a spike of water when they irrigate, and then you can watch the humidity decline over time until they water again. And that water is not coming that humidity is not necessarily coming from the plant. It's coming from evaporation from the substrate. And so we've seen some growers who sort of create like a cover around the substrate, but then you have to be careful with that because then you might not get good oxygenation and breathing
Yes.
around the roots. So, and then if we ask the HVAC system to be really dynamic and dehumidify more during a watering event and then dehumidify less, later, HVAC equipment, it can only do so much. And it's not super responsive. It tries to respond, but let's just say you're in like a 2,000 square foot room. Where do you have your sensors? How many sensors do you have? Are you averaging? Are you controlling based off of a peak temperature or humidity? Right? So the bigger the room you have, you can expect to have more variability, but also your HVAC system can only control to the inputs that it gets. And so, it's not going to react really, really quickly, which is why you see those spikes when lights first turn on or when lights first turn off, because your AC unit needs a minute. Well, it probably needs about 5 minutes to actually respond to that change, which is why it's great when growers dim their lights, do a sunrise, sunset type of schedule, or if they have a sophisticated control system, they can actually program their control algorithm to start ramping up, right, or ramping down, depending on when the lights are going to turn on or off to sort of anticipate a big change in the environment. So, when it comes to monitoring and controls, it's really important to think about um, not only the capacity of your equipment and can it pull out all of that humidity, can it control temperature and remove all that heat from the lights, but also how quickly can it respond? Is it going to go into a defrost cycle? I can't even tell you how many clients now that we've had where we've helped them troubleshoot that all of a sudden their system stops dehumidifying and it starts heating. And that equipment went into like just a standard defrost cycle for 5 minutes, and they literally lose control for 5 minutes of their room. And so then we're like, can we disable it? Can we change the frequency? Like all these different things, and just understanding what your equipment can do and why it's doing what it does. Is important. If nothing else, for just your sanity. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the reasons that I like using the Blue Mat system when they
Mm,
where they make sense.
yeah.
Just for the
Yeah.
idea that you're getting water to the plants at a lower rate, and so it's more consistent. So you don't see as many of those
Yes.
humidity spikes. They're not for every growing situation for sure, and they have pros and cons. But which I'm happy to talk about with anyone who's interested in that sort of irrigation system, because we do work with them. But that is one perk to them that I just want to mention. Now, one other thing that you talked about in terms of how the challenges around all this genetic diversity and everything and optimizing it, we see the same thing with soils and media, and I just want to touch on that because people think that there's
Yeah.
like a best soil out there. Well, there really isn't. As someone who formulates soil and nutrients, like I'm trying to come up with one that's it's almost like a shotgun approach. What's going to work in most situations for most plants to create, their adequate needs, so we won't see any issues with deficiencies and everything will be at sufficiency. But, one of the things that I like to do with the growers that we work with is looking at all these variables that we talk about is also from a nutrient perspective, then do testing so that we can customize the nutrients that we're sending them for their media and their cultivars that they're running in their environment as we see these tests over time. So collecting that data, we can start dialing these things in on the nutrient side. And it would be the same, I assume, on the HVAC side and the environmental control side, in terms of that data collection and slowly optimizing these targets based off of that data.
Yeah. I mean, for you, and when thinking about soils, I mean, how do you decide what is the right water capacity or irrigation frequency or irrigation methodology? I mean, are you also looking at what's happening in the environment around the top of the plant? How, I mean, how do you see those interactions playing out?
Well, I'll start by saying I'm still learning. This is interesting. You're interviewing me. um, I think we're still learning. What I try to do is stay. I think by narrowing the range of variability in terms of the media and water, so that we can keep it within a narrow range, creates better outcomes. So by using blue mats, for example, we're able to reduce the fluctuations in in the soil, and by doing that, we tend to see better overall growth and yields. We have targets that we aim for in our media, but one thing you mentioned is every media is going to be a little different. So the amount of like peat, or if you're using actual soil or cocoa, whatever your media is going to have slightly different water holding capacities. And so all of those things need to be factored in when we look at how, what an optimal soil moisture level is. And so I think it's a
Yeah.
complicated question. I think we're still learning, and I have a pretty good idea for my soils, or soils that have similar base materials. But beyond that, I think we're still learning, and I think that's exciting.
It is. It is. Yeah, when it comes to water, I was talking when I was talking about VPD, and when it's the VPD is really high and the air is really dry, that your plant is there's more pressure, vapor pressure on your plant to transpire and to suck water through it, right, from the roots. If the water is not there, you are more likely going to see a plant start to wilt because it's not a well watered plant. Um, and so then you need to water more frequently, right? And oh, by the way, you may also need to adjust your nutrient levels, because your plant is going to be sucking water so quickly that you might need to add more calcium, because you need to make sure some calcium gets to the plant so that you don't have that calcium deficiency. Or you may need to add more nutrients because the plant is growing so quickly that it needs more nutrients, to pull through there. On the other hand, if your VPD is really low and the humidity is really high, then you probably don't need to water as frequently because your plants aren't going to be transpiring as quickly. And so, your water frequency and your nutrient levels could actually be lower. And it's kind of another way to think about this is that by lowering the vapor pressure deficit, by actually having a slightly more humid environment, we can conserve water and nutrients. I mean, think
So
about that. I mean, what a cool way to conserve water.
yeah, so there's a few topics that I'm going to have you back on in the near future. We're going to have to do a part two, because we haven't talked about water use efficiency and how, one aspect of agriculture is that it uses a ton of water. I was just talking with Kelly Vance over at Beneficial, and he was saying like something like 7 gallons of water is required to grow an almond. And, a lot of these different crops require a lot of water, and we're wasting water when we have drought. And water is such a huge issue right now, for us
Yeah.
as a society. So I want to talk about that. We haven't talked about resource use efficiency. We haven't talked about the benefits of using different sensors. I want to talk to you personally about living soils in vertical grow and airflow and biomass and the amount of soil, and how all those things relate. And I want to talk to you about air filtration, with viruses and bacteria being such a hot topic these days. those are all topics we haven't even gotten to. There is one topic that I absolutely have to get in this podcast, though, because I get asked this question all the time, and I think you might have some good feedback.
Okay.
People want to know about curing and optimal environments for curing.
Curing. Yes.
And there
Yes.
isn't a lot of research out there on this. What can you add to this topic? Sorry, I didn't prep you or warn you. I was going to ask you this.
No. It's totally fine.
What
And by
what could you share about it? I guess.
yeah, sure. And by curing, I'm assuming you also mean drying, because usually the two kind of go in hand, though they are somewhat different processes.
Yes,
Am
and
I
we're
okay?
finding that one interesting anecdote about this is the market has changed from wanting 10 years ago these long cured cannabis flower to now it's about having freshly dried cannabis flower in terms of preserving terpenes, because all of these things are going to slowly dissipate over time. We're going to lose certain things. So how do we best dry cannabis from an environmental perspective, in your experience?
Yeah, in our experience, thank you for the disclaimer. So, we for, so drying and curing are slightly different. Sometimes we see them happening in the same room, in sequential days. Sometimes there's a specific dry room and a specific cure or product storage room, which we see that it being called that now as well. With drying, our goal is to suck out at least 50% of the moisture, or I should say 40% of the moisture as quickly as possible. And I say 40% specifically because I made a comment very early in this podcast that at a 60% moisture content, you have the highest water activity of molds and spores and bacteria. So if we can drop the water content, by 40%, then we are going to really avoid the growth of those diseases and avoid that. A lot of our growers are saying, help us to remove, 40 to 50% of the total moisture content we're going to remove. So let's just say that, the final moisture content that they're going to try to achieve is 12%, right? Somewhere between 10 and 13 or 14%. That they want to get it down to, 40 or 50% in the first 24 hours. Now, doing that is pretty intensive. And kind of the challenge is that we're trying to remove 50% on day one, and then we're trying to remove the remaining, say, 30% over the course of the next 8 or 10 days. And just do sort of a slow burn. So day one is to prevent contamination, and the rest of the time is to preserve those terpenes and trichomes and the quality characteristics that you just spent the last 16 weeks developing. And we don't want to dry it so quickly in the last 8 days of the drying cycle, or whatever that final period is, because we don't want to vaporize the oil that is in those trichomes, right? We want to preserve that as part of the drying process. And if we over dehumidify, if we try to continue removing the same rate of moisture that we did on day one, then we're going to lose a lot of those oils and terpenes in the process. So day one, 50% moisture removal if you can. If you can't do it in 24 hours, then 48 and 72 hours. But we're really pushing it. If we go beyond 48 hours, I would say pushing it in terms of risk of contamination. But again, I had mentioned that HVAC equipment doesn't respond really quickly and doesn't really like a lot of variability if it can help it. And so a lot of times we have a different HVAC system that's operating on day one than we do the rest of the time. And so, because we want to do as much dehumidification as possible on day one and then just a little the rest of the time. And it is almost impossible to find an HVAC unit that can go from, 0 to 100 in the blink of an eye. So that's kind of the drying process, and then I will say that airflow is really essential. I love it when growers are using hanging racks. That is fairly easy for us to move air through, whether it's vertically or horizontally. Baker's racks, oh my God, what a bitch. That's worse than vertical farming. You have such a narrow gap of trying to move air through those flower buds. I want those to go away. I'll be honest. And then when it comes to curing, something that we've started doing, because there's this whole burping thing, right? And what we're trying to do is, you've trimmed the buds, and now you have them in these bins or these buckets or containers, whatever you want to call it, and they're off gassing, right, and they're curing themselves. And in that off gassing, we burp, right? We burp that container to replenish it then with oxygen, with air. And there must be an oxidation process that we're actually trying to facilitate in all of this. And so we replace the what's off gassed with air in the room, and then we close the lid again, and then 24 hours later we do the same thing. Well, what happens if we never ventilate this room, right? If we never bring fresh air into this room, is it possible that this room could become so filled with that off-gassed, compounds, VOCs, that when we burp the container, when we open these containers, we're just refilling that headspace with the VOCs that we, let out yesterday. So what we've been doing and working with growers and sort of getting their permission and getting good feedback on is providing a little bit of fresh air in the cure rooms, just doing a little bit of ventilation, so that we are continuously removing those VOCs and exchanging it with fresh air from the outside. We always filter this air. I don't want anyone thinking that we're just bringing outside air through a window. We're definitely not doing that. We're using high efficiency filters to bring that air in. We'll definitely need, odor mitigation, 95% of the time, because we are releasing those VOCs out, to the outside, to the exterior of the building. But what our growers are telling us is that they're getting good quality by curing with this bit of fresh air and just keeping that air fresh. So, the curing process, it seems to happen. I don't know. I mean, I mentioned that, it has morphed. Some of our projects, the names have morphed into product storage as opposed to a cure room. And I think some of that has to do with the regulations and codes in your specific jurisdiction and where you're located, which is why we're seeing such a variability in that. But ultimately, you're keeping it in that same place until you package it and send it off. And so those buds can stay in that room, right? Anywhere from a couple of weeks to several months. And it's really important to maintain a good temperature in there. But really, when it comes to humidity and moisture control, hopefully, by the time you finish that drying process, if you've moved it into a dedicated cure room, you don't want your flowers to either absorb or release moisture. So when we talk about vapor pressure deficit, this is where the science would really help, is to know what is the right VPD to basically hold that flower in stasis, right? Like, we don't want it to get any more wet or any more dry than it is. Unless that is your goal. And so we, depending on the client, depending on the project and the location, We might have, air conditioning as well as dehumidification and humidification to always be able to very precisely control the cure room, uh, so that we don't dry or wet the final product. Does that help?
Yeah, yeah. The one question I have to all this is, you gave some targets like removing 40% of the moisture in the plant within the first 24 hours and then, tailoring down from there. That's great for a commercial facility or someone with a water activity meter. But what sort of like, I want to also speak to like that home grower or people that don't
Sure.
have the ability to dial in their environmentals quite so much. Like, are there any pointers or targets that you would recommend? Like you alluded to the idea that, baker's racks are not as good as, bucking and dry hanging the plant.
Right.
What other sort of things can we do that you would consider to be, more optimal or best practice in relation to drying?
Yeah, I mean, I think air movement is super key, which is why I don't like baker's racks, 'cause it's just hard to move air through there. So just like in the cultivation facility, if you have high humidity, one way you can mitigate that high humidity is by blowing air across your plants to help break up that boundary layer, help the water move away from the plant that it's transpired and evaporated, rather than it just sort of hovering around the plant. Same thing with the drying room is, even if you can't control to a specific temperature and humidity, is if you're moving air, and not fast, but just you feel the air moving, through that room and across those branches and flowers, then you're probably going to be in good shape. And we want that air to be filtered if possible and recirculated, because we don't want to bring anything in, because, again, we don't want to blow those spores around. If you can target a temperature and humidity, we want the temperature to be less than 70 degrees. I don't think that the temperature needs to be less than 60 degrees. We have some growers who are really trying to chill their plants, but if you can hit 65 or 70 degrees, which most sort of residential or light commercial equipment can do, then the relative humidity to target again is less than 60%. Somewhere between 50 and 60% would be ideal. Again, at that 60%, I talked about moisture content and water activity, but the same is true for relative humidity, is that is the moisture, relatively speaking, pun intended, that's the moisture content of the air. And so keeping the relative humidity below 60% is going to be, helpful. Um, and, the best way to do that, and even in some of our commercial facilities, we do it still, and I said we do it old school, um, with, just some mini splits and dehumidifiers and working together, and that still seems to work pretty well, for a lot of facilities. So air movement, a temperature between 65 and 70 degrees, and a relative humidity less than 60%. And, if you can control those variables, you'll be in good shape.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I think that'll be helpful for people.
Yeah.
Well, we've been talking for a while now. I know you're busy. I would love to follow up with you with some of these other questions on
Let's do it.
another podcast.
Yeah, I'd love to
Awesome.
talk about resource use efficiency in general, dig in more about that water thing. I know, at least here in California, energy is on a lot of people's minds because of the new 2022 code, that was passed. And so I know growers are worried about that. And, anyway, I think there's a lot we can continue talking about. So I'll look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you. Well, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and I look forward to following up with you really soon.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Tad.
Thank you. That was Dr. Nadia Sabeh, also known as Dr. Greenhouse. You can find her on Instagram under the handle Dr. Greenhouse. Be sure to give her a follow because she's always offering new classes, webinars, and speaking around the country. You are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. I'll post pertinent links on the podcast page at www.kisorganics.com. Just click on the Learn tab and then podcast. And if you're looking for soils or soil amendments or fabric beds or blue mats for your facility or garden, please give us a call or hit us up through the website contact page or TAD at kisorganics.com. Thanks for listening.